on our computer. So good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Neil Lichter. I'm a program director here at Pathfinders for Autism. And tonight's presentation with Mark Martin is called Measuring Student Progress on the IEP. Mark Martin has many years experience in litigating special education, juvenile delinquency, criminal and civil rights cases. Mr. Martin was the litigation director of the Public Justice Center in Baltimore. He's also worked for the Legal Aid Society of New York. He's currently contributing as a former chair of the board of directors for the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, and as an advising member to Project HEAL from Kennedy Krieger Institute. I've known Mark for a very long time, reached out to him to do this presentation, and I'm extremely glad that he's able to do it. We are going to take questions through our chat line, so open up your chat room and put your questions in the chat. We'll take a break maybe somewhere in the middle and cover some of these questions. Important to remember that we can't go over individual children's IEPs during this meeting, so if you have questions, they should be general questions about practices and things related to the IEP, but not things specific to your child's particular IEP. Mark does give his name and number out at the end of the PowerPoint presentation, and is certainly willing, if you want to send him questions and things like that, can talk about it. So I'm going to turn this over to Mark. I know this is going to be a great presentation, and enjoy. Thanks, Mark. It's all on you. You're muted.
Okay, thanks, Neil, and thanks to Pathfinders for Autism for putting this together. I mean, I think it's a really important piece of getting word out on what is available for students throughout the classroom and during COVID. And what I want to do this evening is go through sort of a little bit of background on what the state says in terms of what we should be looking at when we're measuring progress, even during the pandemic. Looking at the sources that I look at as a lawyer, and I think judges look at, and when I make arguments at IEP team meetings, of what we consider when we're going through the IEP and consider whether or not progress has been made, and then talk a little bit towards the end about how you can go about sort of making sure you're capturing that progress, since you all are all the teachers right now. And let me just start by saying, anybody in the past, there may have been suggestions at IEP team meetings that what happens at home, and we can only consider what happens at school. You are now the school, as you know, unfortunately. And so you bring the data, you bring the information, and we'll talk a little bit about how we analyze that and look at it. And so let's get started. Make sure everything's hopefully working here. Here we go. I can thank my then 13-year-old son, who I brought to a presentation, and he was very bored, and that's why we now have curtains, because he knew how to work a PowerPoint better than I did, of course. So the State Department of Education, if you ever go on their website, they have what's called technical assistance bulletins. And what they've done recently since the summer is put out technical assistance bulletins called tabs that identify how we're looking at things as we're going through the pandemic. And one of the important things that they've said is that even in times of crisis, even during the pandemic, we're still going to look at the IDEA. The IDEA requires progress monitoring, and the IEP is what we're going to look at for determining whether or not a student is making progress. And you'll see these links here on this page, and at the end, there's a page at the end that's going to give you a hot link also. So that's there, and if you ask me, either Neil can provide them to you, or I can send them to you, but it's under the Technical Assistance Bulletin. If you look at 2003, that's sort of 2020, it's the tab 3 that was implemented. And so this is really looking at the progress monitoring. So this was all done at the start of remote learning, so it's very timely, even though we're going to talk about the IEP, whether there's a pandemic or not a pandemic. During this period of time, the guidance tells us what are we looking at and addressing during extended school closures. Now, we still have extended physical school closures. Schools are open, so to speak. You're the teachers, and there's been modifications to most people's IEPs. But what the State Department has told us, and the federal government has told us, is that the IEP goals that we're looking at are those that are necessary to make progress in the general education curriculum. That's always the standard. That standard hasn't changed. That's what a FAPE is, developing a program of services where a student can make meaningful progress both on their IEP goals and objectives and in access and making progress on the general education curriculum. It also says that during this closure, what the team should be doing when they're looking at what the services are that are being provided to your student is that those services, the goals and objectives should be implemented to the greatest extent possible. Now, like everything else in life and in law, how you interpret that can be taken in different ways. So I interpret that as meaning that the school and the IEP team should be maximizing to the greatest extent possible their ability to implement as many goals and objectives as they can to ensure that the student is making progress. And that's what I advocate for. And that's how I plainly read this language. School systems, or some of them I should say, will interpret that as saying, well, that's the great extent possible that we can do it, versus meaning what our capacity is. I don't think the case law supports that. I think that they should be maximizing this to the greatest extent possibles. And so, well, certainly they're going to take in the factors of distance learning or virtual learning or hybrid learning or in the environment, which is going to impact what skills can or maybe sometimes cannot be worked on. What we really want to be doing is trying to implement the goals and objectives. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on. Your IEP, which many of you have worked hours and hours on, is really your guide. And so the supplemental aids and services are a really important component of your IEP. And we have found in our office that one of the ways that we've been able to help families in having their students be successful during virtual learning is really going to those IEPs, manipulatives, repeating directions, modifying the work, modifying the answers, modifying the questions. All of those things can still and should be done through collaboration of the special educator and the general educator before work is coming home to your student. And if they are able to do, and they should be giving you manipulatives that you can work with, if they do that, that can really make a significant difference for your child. That's a little bit of a sideshow in terms of what they can do. In terms of measuring progress, though, it's important to understand that we're going to measure progress on as much of the IEP as we can. So what else says that MSD said? So they have another tab, which is called tab 2009. And this was really this was a little bit later in the process when we're talking about reopening the schools. So once the schools were going to be reopened, even though it's hybrid or virtual in most situations, the question was, how does the local school system prepare to make the determination about the appropriateness of the IEP in effect and the need for compensatory education or recovery services? So recovery services is one of these new phrases that we're hearing more and more. It has not been fully defined. I think that it remains to be seen what that's going to completely look like. I suspect that's going to be, at some point, there's going to be an offering of recovery services generally, which I think is different than compensatory educational services, which I think will be more individualized towards the individual student for the lack of progress that they've made for denial of FAPE. But in either event, whether it's compensatory services or recovery services, what we're looking at the individual strengths and needs of the student. And all of the information should be driven by data. This is no different than when our students are attending school. It's data driven. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to go through the IEP a little bit and some of the areas of data. So data takes various forms, and this is, again, from the State Department of Education. We're looking at grades, we're looking at progress reports, we're looking at classwork, informal and formal evaluations, teacher service provider observation. So let me just pause on that one, because if you are required, right, if you need to sit with your student, if you are working with your student, if the student requires your attendance there, you are their service provider. So your observations are important and relevant data and should be an essential part of the consideration of what the student needs. And if it wasn't, the State Department's clearly said parent feedback, and then comparison to the progress of all students, which an interdisciplinary consults, you're not going to have that information. But in terms of progress reports, classwork, attention, what you're seeing, that's all really important information that you're going to want to bring to the IEP team, both for developing an appropriate IEP, measuring and monitoring progress, and then ultimately being able to show the team why there needs to be a change in services or compensatory, or I guess recovery services provided to your student. So when we're thinking about this, the school system has made some suggestions. I'm sorry, the State Department of Education has made some suggestions in terms of what else you're going to look at. So one of the things that we're looking at is formative assessments, which is a type of data that the school system can provide to sort of see where the student is functioning at the moment in time, and have they learned the work that's been made available. Did the student make the expected amount of progress on the IEP goals and objectives? And if not, what type or what different services need to be provided to narrow the gap between what was expected and what was actually provided? So what does that mean? So for instance, if you know that your student was making X amount of progress prior to March of 2020, and now you've come into the new school year, many school systems are using a lot of online, if I know, I may have heard of iReady or other types of online assessments to see where the student is performing. And they've done that over the last 4 weeks, hopefully, saying, where is the student now? And what you want to be able to do, what they should be doing is saying, well, is that the progress that they are now, which is, you know, after a year, let's say, after the last school year, has that compared to how the student did the prior year? And so when we look at that, we can say, do we need to provide different or additional services, or are things going fine with the current level of services that are being offered? So when we're looking at that, we're looking at not only from the formative assessment, but some of the other areas that we talked about earlier. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how we're going to collect that data. So there's a variety of places where we find data, and much of that, it comes through your general education report cards. It also comes through your IEP. It also comes through your private testing or your school system testing. And some of these things might be familiar to you. So there's always our statewide assessment data, right? So that's your PARCC exams, the MSA, high school assessments, or whatever name or acronym they're currently using, because those change frequently. But what those statewide assessments are doing is evaluating where your student is starting in 3rd grade, going all the way through 12th grade, in comparison to what the expected curriculum is and the criteria that our State Board of Education has established for students in that grade. And that's really important information. Don't let anybody sort of downplay or discard that information as not being important or informative as to how your student is doing, because it tells us one way or another, based upon the expectations that are set, how they compare. Now, there may be reasons why they're doing well or not doing well on that assessment data, and that's the conversation that should be generated based upon their score. But it doesn't mean that you discount that. There was a time when school systems, a lot of local school systems, tried to discount the statewide data. I don't think we should let that happen. There's a reason we disaggregate it. There's a reason that it's designed to look at not just students without disabilities, but students with disabilities. Then within each regular jurisdiction, you're going to have different ways that they measure data. So a MAP, which is a measure of academic progress, it's going to look at, like, and that's, you know, Baltimore County, I know that's a very frequent jurisdictional assessment that they use. It's measuring how the student is doing in reading and in math. And you may recall, if you've ever seen a MAP report, and if you haven't, you should ask for one if you're in Baltimore County, because there's certainly throughout elementary school, those are being provided. And they're going to show you where the student is performing, how that compares with other students, and how that compares with what they project that student's growth rate should be. And they show that in the winter, they show it in the fall, they show it in the winter, and they show it in the spring. And if you take that, you can look at that not only within the given year, but you can compare it in the prior year. So one thing that you might want to do, and that I know that I do when I'm assessing whether a student has made progress, I'm looking not only are they utilizing, let's just say, the MAP score, are they on grade level or in the range that they're supposed to be currently? If they're not and they're below grade level, is that how far below are they, and is it significant for this year? And then I also go back and I look at the past 2, 3, or 4 years, and I assess, well, has their gap increased or has it decreased? So for instance, maybe in second grade, the student was on grade level. Maybe in third grade, they were just maybe 3 or 4 percentage points below where they should be. Then by fifth grade, they were 10 or 15%, or let's just say it's even 7. And a school system might say, well, it's only 7 percentage points below. But if you look at that over time, what you're seeing there is a doubling over the last year or two and a tripling if you go back more than a couple of years. So you have to look not only at the current scoring, but also the historical precedent. And that's how you're measuring progress over time. So progress in the immediate school year is important, but progress over time is also telling us whether or not the program is being effective. And is it going to be effective in the long run? Because if the downward trend is down or flat and the student is not closing the gap, then I would argue that something new or different needs to be done. And then it also lets you look at of how the student did in 2019, maybe in the first half of the school year. So the winter map, the fall map score versus the fall map score of this year might tell us how the student is doing in those 2 different points of time. One was in school instruction, one was in a virtual instruction. So the quarterly benchmarks, I'm in Anne Arundel County. Anne Arundel County does quarterly assessments that are cumulative and look at how the student is performing compared to the Anne Arundel County curriculum. And again, very important information. They come at the end of the quarter. It tells you if the student has the student learned the chapter, have they learned the benchmark, have they learned the information that's being presented? Because we want to know not only how they're doing on a test, a standardized test, such as a statewide test, but how are they doing on the material that's being presented in the classroom. And then individual schools will use different things. So these are 2 reading tests, Dibbles and Fontes and Pinnell. And again, this is going to give us how they're performing grade-wise or reading-wise. And you can compare that over currently as vis-a-vis other students who are their same age or grade. But you could also look at how they're performing over time. So if they have remained, for instance, Fontes and Pinnell uses a letter system, are they at an A level, a B, a J, a K level of reading? You can look up, a year ago, were they at a J level? 2 years ago, were they at the J level? Has that progressed, and has it progressed enough? And some of these things, if you are not familiar with these terms, just go online and Google Fontes and Pinnell scoring chart, and you'll get a chart that's going to show you what the letter level they should be at for each grade year. And then there's the curriculum standards, which we've talked about a little bit already when we're talking about quarterly benchmarks. And then report cards are, I think, an underutilized area, especially for behavior and especially for students with autism, especially in the younger grades. So social relationships are a part of our life. Social relationships are something that we work towards. Peer relationships are something we work towards. And those things are marked, especially on a K through 2 report card. You'll notice, you'll have your reading, you'll have your writing, you'll have your music and your art, but then usually in that right-hand side, the bottom of the page, it's going to say, is the student polite? Are they respectful? Are they sharing? All sort of behavioral indicators of the expectation, especially for our youngest students, of what they should be doing and how they should be performing. So the report cards, don't overlook those as a standard of a place to look for what is the expectation being set by the school system? Because if you remember, what was the first slide it talked about is how are they progressing in the general education curriculum? Then, and we're going to go through the next 2 in more detail, but the IEP, functional level, present levels of performance, and the progress reports are things that, if you have an IEP, you're familiar with. And again, you're going to look at those present levels of performance currently and in the past. So just a few more areas, and the reason I put all of these areas up there is that you shouldn't feel limited as to what you can consider at an IEP team meeting or to evaluate whether or not your student is making progress. All these are important areas, and all these are areas that you should be considering as you're going through the process. So if you have any private tutors or the student receives any individual tutors, you should be considering that. If the student is receiving either privately or publicly, especially speech language services or occupational therapy services, each speech language pathologist, every occupational therapist keeps a log. They're required to. In that log, they have with specificity, or they should, how the student is performing in the individual session that they're working with them. You can ask for those logs. So I would ask for, and I do in my practice, we'd like the speech language pathologist logs, we'd like the occupational therapist logs. We'd like to then look at those, and we can see, when you start looking at those, you can really see, are they probing and are they implementing the IEP goals and objectives that are there, and are they taking testing whether or not that student is making progress. And then formalized academic testing, of course, is your Woodcock-Johnsons, your Weschlers, your cognitive testing, your gray oral reading, your test of written language. These are all the sort of standardized tests that are generally occurring or being considered at least once every 3 years for a triennial evaluation. Though as a parent, you have the right to ask for updated testing after every year. If the year has passed, you have the right to ask for updated educational testing. Okay, so that's some of the places where we're looking for and where we find the data. So we've talked a little bit about this already, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but the State Board of Education sets the high stakes and standardized testings. This is commonplace within our schools, and it's what you know that come March, especially for kids 3 through 8, they're spending 3 weeks in March going through testings. And this is what, you know, we're told our kids are supposed to learn. And that is the expectation set by the school board. And that is we should hold them accountable to teach our kids that information. So let's turn to the IEP. And for those of you that are not within the state of Maryland, this is a Maryland state IEP. And when you're looking at it, you're going to have a similar IEP if you're not within, if it's not, even if this is not your state. There's some basic requirements that need to be in every IEP based upon federal law. So in this one, what we're looking at here is how is the student doing in the state standardized assessments. And you can see this red writing. I don't know if it's, whoops. Let's see. Let's see if we can go back. No. Okay, I'm sorry, I apologize for moving that forward, but those state standards are gonna, here we go, okay. Thanks for bearing with my technology skills. So right here above domain, statewide Maryland Comprehensive Assessment Program, performance summary, see, this is the standardized state tests. And so you're seeing English language arts, mathematics, algebra, social studies. This should all be filled in. If level 4 is meeting expectations, level 5 is exceeding expectations, level 3 is approaching expectations. You need to ask your IEP team to get you this data. All too many times I find that this is not filled in on the IEP. School systems have it. You should be also receiving it by mail. And this is the information that you want to receive and you want to review with the team so that you know how your student is doing based upon the state standards that have been set.
Payments.
So then these are the high school assessments. Again, same thing. We want to know how the student is doing. So this is a page that's in your IEP. It should be reviewed. If your team doesn't have that information, as part of your IEP, you said, let's take a moment. Who can pull this up on the computer? Who can get us this information? We want to know where they're performing. Are they proficient in these areas? They should be. And if they're not, then the conversation has to be, what are the services and what does this look like over time? And how do we measure that information? So where does that information come from? And again, this is going to come from your state curriculum. So Maryland has a Maryland state curriculum. Each school system has a minimum, which establishes a minimum amount of information that the student has to learn. And each jurisdiction can increase that amount of information, but they can't go below it. And we'll get to shortly. The state curriculum is online, and what you want to do is you want to go online. You want to look at the state curriculum, and you want to compare where your student is performing with what the state curriculum says the student should be able to accomplish. And if they're not accomplishing it, so if your students at 3rd grade should be able to be reading, 3 sentences fluently in a paragraph. It's just an example, it's not accurate. And they're reading 1 sentence, then what you want to do is backward map from that standard of 3 sentences. Say, how is your student going to go from 1 sentence to 3 sentences? And that should be the basis of your goals and your objectives, and then looking at the services that are necessary to get there. So that's how we're sort of thinking about building our IEP, and that's important because, as we're going to talk about a little bit, you're going to look to that IEP. Again, it's one of those sources of data for progress monitoring. So when you're evaluating compensatory education or recovery services, or just what do we have to do for next year or currently for my students, we're going to look at those progress reports. But the standard is set by the state. And so here it is. Right. So if you Google, Maryland state curriculum, they set frameworks, and these are all hot links online. And they're going to tell you what, if you click on pre-kindergarten, K through 2, 6 through 8, it's going to tell you what the expectation is for reading different types of literature, informational texts. It's going to talk about different units of study. And this is what has been established, 10 years ago for what students should be learning. And so if you have questions, and the school system should be able to answer those questions of what the expectation is. But if you want to have your own information or see the information firsthand, you want to dig down into it, then I recommend you go online and you look at what the college and career ready standards are, and you click on some of these links, and it'll give you an idea of what the expectations should be for a student in your child's grade. So we have the state assessments, which are based on the state curriculum, and then we have standardized assessments. And we've talked a little bit about this already in terms we're looking at educational, psychological, and other types of assessments. So this is going to tell us, 1, how the student's performing year over year, and how they're performing over a period of time, over 3 years. And what I do, for instance, I'll take the information from the Woodcock-Johnson. I will write down, here's the student score in letter word identification. Here's the student score in reading comprehension. And then, for instance, I'll look at that. How did they do in 2014? How did they do in 2017? How did they do in 2020? What was their standard score? What was their grade level score? Those are 2 very important sort of indicators that will tell me how they're doing over time. Now, some students may do better than others on those types of standardized assessments. Other students may need more modifications or supports in their testing to reflect their knowledge. And with curriculum-based assessments, you're generally going to be entitled to more information. So then, don't know how Michael did that. So then there's also, you're going to look at the curriculum-based assessments, the report card information, and then the state-wise test, which we've talked about a little bit already. And the important thing here is, I just want to, as this is fading away, is we're looking at multiple sources. So when we're looking at the assessments, we don't want to be looking at just the one statewide Woodcock-Johnson, but you want to look at the curriculum-based assessments and the report cards, and of course the IEP itself. So the IEP is really the academic levels. So it's important to read our IEPs. They're very thick documents. They can be very small print, but really, if you take the time, should be a lot of information that can be helpful for you. So the first thing is you're going to have the student's academic achievement and functional performance levels. So note that that talks about academic achievement and functional performance. What's the functional performance? Peer relations, peer communication, behavior, which is communication also, ability to stay on task, executive functioning. That's all functional performance, and that's all a part of what should be considered by the IEP team. That's what Congress told us. And so we're looking at that, and you're looking at your IEP and you're developing your IEP. And I'm going a little bit towards IEP development right now, because IEP development is how you set up your measurable data, right? We talked about you need your data. State Department said we need to evaluate data. We rely upon data. It's in this portion of your IEP where you're getting a baseline set in your IEP. So what do we look at? So this should not be left blank. I see it all too often. What's the source? You should have your most recent, again, stuff, the writing in red is my writing. It's my annotations to this Maryland State document. But this is the most recent public and private tests with data and the evaluator name, right? So you want the evaluator you want whoever picks up the IEP to know that Dr. Lichter, you've been promoted. Dr. Lichter did a psychological evaluation on September 20th, 2020, and that is put into the source information here in your IEP. Then you want to be able to say, what's the instructional grade level performance? What is the specific? If they merely write below grade level, that in most cases, that is in 90% of the cases, that's not going to be sufficient. We know from our standardized assessment, from the source data, that, and even from some informal assessments or some curriculum assessments, students are going to be operating at, let's say, a 1.7 grade level for fluency, or a 7.9 level for reading comprehension. That should be put here. Where are they on an instructional level? And then there should be a summary of all the areas of need that you're going to want accommodations and goals and objectives for. That's what should be put here in the summary for the assessment findings. They should be not be copying and pasting the entire report. That does no one any good. It creates too long of a document. The longer the document is, it's harder for people to read and ascertain what the important components are. And then ultimately, based upon this question is, of course, one of the questions under the law to whether or not the student qualifies for special education services or needs direct instruction, AKA special education services. Does this impact the student's ability, the student's academic achievement, and or functional performance? If the answer is yes, then you're going to be looking at direct services. So just a quick nod here, when you're developing your IEP or reviewing your IEP, one of the things, because it could be now that you're going back and you're looking at the IEP that was developed and you want to say, excuse me, what are the goals observable? Are there behavior that you can see the student doing? So for instance, if the goal is that the student will not engage in any interfering behaviors, well, you can't really see that, right, necessarily. I mean, someone could be sleeping and not engaging in any interfering behaviors. It really wants to be a positive, observable goal. So the difference of that might be the student will, when given an academic task, the student will initiate that task within 5 seconds and complete the assigned task in accordance to the rubric established by the classroom teacher. You can see whether they initiate, you have a time frequency, and you know what they have to do. So that when you observe it, you're then having a measurable goal that's measured in quantitative terms, because ultimately, again, we want the data. So if it's not measurable, it's not observable, and it's not measurable quantitatively, then it's not going to be any good to us in the data. And because the State Department of Education tells us we have to use the data, that's what you're asking for. The acronym SMART is used in many different industries. And it basically, SMART means it's a smart, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time sensitive, right? So specific, measurable, attainable, relevant. So specific, as we just described, you need to be able to measure it. It has to be reasonable. We want the student to be able to achieve it. It has to be relevant in terms of it should be focused on what the student's deficits, and there should be a specific time frame for accomplishing it. So these are just a couple of ideas to when you're reviewing your IEP for progress, think about, do you have good functional levels of performance, and do you have good goals and objectives? Because those are what you're going to need for when you're measuring your IEP progress. So how do you know if what the school team is doing is working? How do you know if your student is making progress? So the first thing is you've got to read so every quarter you should be receiving, 4 reports on how the student is doing on the specific goal and the specific objective. So one thing that I find just is that when you read it, you have to make sure that it matches the goal or objective. And what do I mean by that? So for one student I represented in a jurisdiction, the goal was for the student to make progress on a 2nd grade, or I think it was an 8th grade reading level, and with specific criteria for that. The result, unfortunately, what was being reported on the goals and objectives was that the student was passing social studies and science and was engaging in the readings during that class. So it was telling me what they were doing grade-wise, what they were doing in a content class, but it wasn't telling me what their letter word identification was on specifically, which is what the goal and objective was asking for. Was the student reading at a 6.7 grade level? Tell me that what their test score is on a social study exam is not telling me how they're reading. So you need to make sure, that when you look at your progress reports for your IEP, that they are matching what the goals and objectives are. And if they're not, then you have to ask them to go back and get better data. Then you need to have a data collection that is systematic in its frequency. So behaviors, I think, is an easier example for this. So does the data, are we measuring, is the student initiating their instruction? Or are they following directions? It doesn't have to be every single day, 180 school days a year, but are we measuring that in a way that's easy to be collected by the teacher, and so that we're getting at it in a systematic way? So are we looking at it, every Monday and Tuesday in the morning, every Thursday and Friday in the afternoon? And this way we're getting a morning data point, we're getting a afternoon data point, and then we're collecting that regularly so that we can look at if there are problems or areas where the student is not being successful, that we are in fact have data that we've collected, and therefore can then consider in figuring out what works or what does not work. And then the other part of that, of course, is that I've had way too many behavior plans where we find that the students, that they've collected data, but they've never analyzed it. And I see that quite frequently in behavior plans. There's a behavior intervention plan, they collect the data, but no one has ever gone back and analyzed it. So you need to take those data. So what's a good example of that? When you get the smiley faces at home, whether I agree or disagree with the smiley face is a different issue, that says whether the student's doing what they're supposed to do or whether they're collecting points. You can take those data sheets and then you can put them on a calendar, and then you can start looking at how are they doing over a week, or are there specific days of the week where they're not doing well? They need to be analyzed. It's not just collecting the data, but you need to make sure the team is analyzing it as well. So this is just a sort of a specific example of where we're looking at the things that I've just described to you. So when you receive the IEP progress report, the information listed is here in objective 1 on these lines. This is going to tell us the description of here's your goal. And it's going to tell us specifically there should be data that's reflecting whether or not they're making progress. Oftentimes you're just going to see achieved pressed, which is just sort of a default, I think, unless it's a teacher feels that there's a significant issue. But if they're saying the student is achieving or is making sufficient progress to meet the goal. I've had IEPs that go back 5 years where the student has never achieved a goal and has only said making sufficient progress to meet the goal. And that's a problem. because we should be achieving our goals. If they are making sufficient progress, you want to just make sure that the narrative in the description boxes matches the goal, so that they actually are making sufficient progress by accomplishing the objectives or getting closer to the standard that has been set, both in terms of the accuracy and the trials over time of that specific goal and objective. So your IEP progress report, this is one of the first places I look to see, is there progress being made? If there's not, then that's a reason to say that there hasn't been sufficient services provided. And then what we're going to do is we're going to sort of loop around. We're going to look at and loop through both all the data, right? So if we do an initial assessment and we're collecting that assessment and we're evaluating through that assessment how the student is doing, we're then going to use that assessment information again. This is multiple assessments over multiple areas, right? We're going to be looking at, is there standardized assessments, curriculum-based assessment, or informal assessments or observations. And we're going to use that information for the IEP goals and objectives. And then when we put in those present levels of performance and we put in those IEP goals and objectives, we're then going to measure, based upon our data, whether the student is making progress on that. And once we do that assessment, that is another form of assessment, right? So we've collected the data, and then we're going to, again, the analysis is really the key here, that we're going to analyze whether or not the student, based upon the data that we've collected, is making progress. If they are, that's great. We return to the goals and objectives. We continue doing what we're doing. If they're not, then we return to the goals and the objectives or the accommodations or the supplemental services. And then we adjust the IEP goals and objectives, and we see if there's, or we adjust the services. We may keep the goals and objectives, but we may adjust the services and see if the student, then again, we collect the data and we figure out, okay, are they making progress now that we've adjusted services? And then we go through this again and again in a loop of assessment, goals, data collection, and then following that through both in the individual school year and then measuring it over time, of course, if you're looking at it for an overall picture of whether or not the program or services are sufficient or working for your student. So one of the things that we're sort of facing is, how do we measure data during this very difficult time that we're all going through? How do we determine whether or not there has been progress, and how do we determine whether or not what we're doing is working? And so there's a couple of things. First one we've talked about, we're going to study the IEP. But in particular, what I want you to do is go back and study the IEP and look at your quarterly progress reports in January and in March of 2020. This is your baseline data. This is where you know your student was performing when they were getting in-school services, live in-school services at the time. And so the data that was collected from September to maybe the end of the first quarter in October, and then again around the end of January, and even any information you gathered up until March, middle of March, when school in person ended, that's the information that you're going to know. That's where your student was functioning instructionally. And so then when they're doing those formative assessments that we talked about earlier, now that students have returned to the classroom, all the school systems have been instructed to gather data about how they're doing. We're going to compare what their baseline is now. So find out, especially in your K-5 classrooms, they're gathering data on reading and on math and how they're performing. So you want to ask the school system, have you taken formative or baseline data for how the student is doing? And we're now, a good solid more than a month into school, that should have happened. And if it hasn't happened, you need to ask for it to happen so that you know where the student is performing. So that's one set of data, where they were at the point in time in January and March, where they are now. And then with our students at home, we can gather and create data as we're working with the students. So I've had a number of clients, and this has been effective, and you can take the IEP and what is the student working on? Are they supposed to be working on a second grade book? Are they supposed to be counting coins? Or are they supposed to be doing math? Or are they supposed to be doing like addition or subtraction or division? And you can utilize what's being sent home from school or stuff that they did last year, or just go online and look for grade level materials. And if you go onto some teacher websites, they have lots of materials. And go ahead and ask your student to do what's asked, what you're testing in the IEP. So if the IEP is testing counting coins, ask them to count the coins, observe them. You can videotape it, pick up your phone, videotape how they're doing. How are they doing reading? Are they reading grade level instructional books? Are they supposed to be reading, is their instructional level in their present level performance at a second grade level? And then give them that grade level book and videotape them doing it. And then you can take that information and you can show that information to the IEP team, because they have to consider the data that you're collecting and you as the parent. And then you have then created and maintained a set of data that you can then utilize in making determinations about whether or not your student is making progress. Number 3 is really important in this section, recording behavioral observations. For many of our kids, it's really, really hard for them to be able to be successful in maintaining their executive functioning skills and staring at a screen throughout the full day. And we have the opportunity, because we are in the homes with our kids, to record that. So just take a spiral notebook or take a calendar, and you can observe, if the class is 45 minutes, how long did the student attend to that 45-minute class? Did they attend the first 10 minutes? Did they attend all 45 minutes? If 20 minutes in they started getting distracted, did you have to refocus them? Did you have to redirect them? How many times? Just keep a check mark. You could have columns, with the time, redirection, check marks, and then comments. What did they do? So did they remain focused? Did you redirect them? Did they then follow? If they were refusing to follow or couldn't maintain their attention, what were they doing? Were they at least engaging with the screen in the classroom, or were they on the floor? Were they, walking away from the table? Were they, checking out and getting on their phone? What were they doing? These are all things that you can observe and then bring that data back to the team to say, my student only stays focused for 10 out of the 45 minutes, or they stay in math, it's 10 out of 45 minutes. In language arts, it's 40 out of 45 minutes. Well, that's telling you something. And you can write that down on a calendar, and you can see, maybe is it different times of day? Is it different days of the week? But oftentimes it has to do with the subject matter. And then that will help you know that you might need more additional supports during a specific subject matter. So once we have that information, what do we do with it? Well, the first thing, as we talked about, is if we're at our IEP meeting, we're going through our loop. We're going to address the past deficits that may have existed and new deficits that we see through the IEP meeting. Based upon what we've learned with that data, we're going to start at the IEP meeting and seek additional services if that's what you think is needed by your student. Again, right, the IEP, we know what the student needs from their IEP that was developed last year. Those are the accommodation, those are the support services that are necessary. If a student was having a difficult time without having an instructional support in the classroom, certainly it's going to be much harder outside of the classroom. Can there be an instructional support person put on through a video? Can their student be looking at more than one screen? Can the manipulatives be brought home? Are there different things that can be done within the current learning environment to figure out a way to support the student? What are if the student's not making progress, do we need more hours of service? My experiences and experiences of my office or that decisions are made, quite frankly, at the IEP team table during this time. And many teachers, if you ask for more services, will work with you to provide more services and figure out a change in scheduling. Merely saying office hours is not more services to me. There needs to be a scheduled time when the teacher will be working with the student. It could be during office hours, but the availability of office hours is not sufficient. They need to be on their schedule. And working with the student during that period of time is, you have to figure out if they can't meet their needs, then you need to then you go beyond that individual school and you're looking at someone from the Office of Special Education, central office staffs to bring in more support, or is there change in placement that is necessary? And then the question becomes, do they have the right to compensatory educational services, which is taking all the information and data that you have. Was the student making reasonable educational progress? If they were not making meaningful educational progress, then you have a claim that the services weren't appropriate, and you need compensatory educational services in order to make up for the services that have been received or haven't been received. Whether they haven't received them, whether they received them and they weren't sufficient, if you have a history over time of the student not making progress, then you're entitled to compensatory educational services. I will say, I think if your only claim for lack of progress is during, March, April, May, and June, I don't think you're going to get very far with that judge probably. I think that information is what you utilize to say what you need now. But if the student is doing well now with the services, unless there's something that's really glaring, I think school systems, understandably, were in an emergency situation during that period of time. You can make the argument, and I'm not saying you might be successful in making it, but I think you should use caution in when you're bringing a claim for comp-ed services just for that period of time when things were an emergency, especially if it was like, everybody went home in March and April, and, those were the time when you weren't getting the appropriate services. I think you're going to have a hard time. You might be able to prove it. You might be able to prove it on paper, and you might be able to get some services, but I think it's a harder case if it's just limited to that. This is one lawyer's opinion. And so what you really are looking for is clear data that shows what they're doing is not working. And I think that information that you gather during that time will tell you perhaps that virtual instruction is not working, or the level of virtual instruction is not working, or there needs to be additional services provided in order to be successful now. And I think you can sort of argue that and utilize that data for that purpose to increase your services now, whether it's considered compensatory or not. But solely just a sole compensatory claim, I think probably doesn't work. So here are some of the links we talked about. State Department of Education's publications, the Technical Assistance Bulletin, and the IDA. The federal website also has some good training modules and informations. If people have any questions subsequent to this, feel free to contact me. And here's my contact information. I'll turn it back over to Neil. And we can go through, if there's any questions, I have time, I can stay on if there's any questions that need to be addressed.
There were a couple of questions put in the chat box. When the teacher puts down making sufficient progress, that's sort of a nebulous term. What does that truly mean? And what is it that constitutes sufficient progress?
Yeah, so it is a nebulous term. And so that's where I think what you want to do is, well, let me say it this way. Making sufficient progress is an insufficient term for me. What you want to do is go back to those data collection points and that description. Does it match the goal or the objective? And so the question really, what it's supposed to mean is that if the student maintains the pace that they're on, they will achieve the goal by the end of the IEP. An IEP is developed with the reasonable expectation that we've developed a goal that the student can achieve within 1 year. And so if you have making sufficient progress in the first quarter and they've made 25% of progress, then that's probably right. If you're in the third quarter and they've made 25% progress, then that's probably wrong. and they're probably not making sufficient progress. And so merely having that checked off, I always look at the underlying data, whether that's the description or the curriculum-based assessments are really helpful in that particular time, or any other standardized, or any trials they've done, like in speech language or occupational therapy.
Okay. Another question in the chat box: when the child is assessed formally, should informal assessments be used in addition to the formal assessments? And should schools write the name of the informal assessments on the IEP?
Yeah, I think they're both very helpful. I think that I don't think that you would get any disagreement from any educator that you should have multiple sources of assessments. And that's what you say. Should we rely just on this test, or should we have multiple sources? And it's a loaded, they can't say no to that. And so the informal assessments are going to give you information about how they do informally. And so the other way that I like to sort of frame that when I talk about informal assessments is classroom performance. So maybe the student has done well or better on the standardized assessment, and there's probably some reasons for that. It's one-on-one, it's in a quiet environment, and it's narrow in its focus. But then when they're in the classroom, can they do the same? Are they operating at the same skill level? And if they're not, then that informal assessment is telling you something about the student's performance level in the general education curriculum, which is what the law ultimately says we're supposed to be able to do, which is make progress in the general education curriculum and make progress on so we're looking at our curriculum-based assessments. So I'd be looking at both, and yes, that should be in the IEP.
Okay. Someone asked, is there such thing as an IEP for people who homeschool?
So if you are homeschooling legally, then you have no rights under the IDEA. So the IDEA is a public school benefit. If you are homeschooling, that means you've withdrawn your child from the public school system and you're just showing proof that you in fact are educating your child, so you're complying with the truancy laws. So you in essence lose your IDEA rights. So there is no IEP.
Gotcha. How often should IEP goals be worked on? Is there a time frame for goals? Can teachers pick and choose the goals they'll work on each quarter?
So the goals are annual in nature, and they should be worked on so that they're accomplished within the entire school year. Objectives can be done in multiple ways. Some objectives are step-based. And what I mean by that is you accomplish the first objective. Let's just an example, you're gonna stay on task. The goal is to stay on task 70% of the time. So the first objective might be stay on task 10%. Second objective might be stay on task 30%. Third objective is 50%, and the fourth objective is 70%. So you're accomplishing each objective. So it depends what your objectives say. So another IEP might have 4 different objectives, and those should definitely be worked on all the time, really, if they're separate, and that is the goal, to accomplish those by the end of the school year. Does this teacher have to work on each and every objective each and every day? No, they don't. Just like you might not be working on subtraction each and every day, but you might be working on it over the course of time. So, there's got to be a little bit of reasonableness there and some common sense in terms of what should be worked on. But the simple answer is they should all be worked on so that they can be accomplished by the end of the IEP in 1 year. So that's the question, right? If the goal is not being worked on, I think the fair question is, I understand you're not working on this goal or this objective right now, but how can you tell me we're going to meet this at the end of the year, which we all spent 3 hours with 15 people around the table developing this IEP and said we all thought this was a reasonable goal for the student. So just tell me how you're going to do it, because maybe I don't understand because I'm a parent.
Okay. If this is too specific, let me know. Somebody said they requested an email for baseline data, not just summaries, back in September to prep for IEP meetings. Is there a time limit in which the school must provide that prior to the IEP meeting date?
So those are 2 different questions. So one, under Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, you have the right to ask for the educational record. And you should be able to get that. There's no specific time for that, but you should be able to get that probably within 30 days, 45 days at the outset. In terms of what's going to be you are entitled to before the IEP meeting, in Maryland, which is different than other states, we're lucky in this way. We're entitled to our documents that are to be considered by the IEP team five business days before the meeting. So if this is information that's going to be considered by the IEP team, then you should have it 5 business days before the meeting.
Okay, good. Somebody asked something about the Governor of Maryland Youth Initiative. Can you explain what that is or how it's being implemented? Or is that something that we're not covering tonight?
I think you've hit the answer there, Dr. Neal.
Okay. Whoever sent that in, I will, if you want to email me here at the office, I will start to look into that and try and get an answer for you. That my email is, well, you've definitely gotten it, more than one email from me in the last day or so, sending out links and things like that. So that's all the questions we have in the chat box. Mark, I want to thank you. I think this is extremely helpful and answers a lot of questions for parents about things that are going on that since school has started in such a different way for all of us. And I know for one that it's extremely difficult doing virtual schooling for my son who's on the autism spectrum. So I think getting this kind of information is really, really important. And having somebody like you be able to come in and give us your time and this information is extremely helpful. So thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Neil. I appreciate it. And thank you to, again, I think it's great work that your organization does in making this available to everybody from multiple sources.
Thanks very much.
So good luck to everybody and have a great evening.
Thank you. So for everybody, like I said, this has been recorded. We're going to put this out. It's going to be on our website. I'm also going to email it to everybody who is on the registration list. I'm also going to send out a SurveyMonkey survey. So give us your evaluations because your opinions help us informing who we bring in to speak, the times of the presentations, the topics you want to hear about. So if you get a chance to fill out that survey, it'll probably go out to you tomorrow. And I thank everybody for joining us tonight. Keep an eye open for all the upcoming workshops, great workshops we have coming up about interacting with police, potty training, social skills, behavior challenges, and things like that. We have our Ungala coming up in November, celebrating our 20th year. So keep an eye open for that. And thank you all so much and have a great evening.
Thank you, Neil.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Trish.